Hello everyone, it's Michelle here. I hope you're doing well. Welcome to another video. Hope you're having a great day. It is raining cats and dogs here in northern England this morning, so I'm going to stay under the cover of the trees to stay as dry as possible. So in this video I want to talk about psychology, the psychology of the Wells family. Now, I've done videos on psychology in relation to the Wells before. I did one recently on the psychology of SA and how that relates to Don Wells' family, for example. But I want to broaden it out in this video. I want to focus on attachment disorder, and more specifically, insecure attachments. A caveat before I start: this is not intended to diagnose anybody at all, whether that be Don, Candice or Little Summer. If people tell you that they're able to diagnose psychological disorders using videos, then don't believe them. You can't. These are just indicators. In videos, in interviews with people, you're only seeing a small amount of information. Clinical diagnoses involves a lot of information being kind of put together, and in many cases discussed by a whole clinical team. So this video is not intended to be diagnostic in any way, although I'm using the term disorder. It's just because that's what it's known by. Take it as my opinion. But I'm going to show you some evidence from the literature on attachment disorder. I'm going to talk about that first, and then I'm going to go on to how that relates to Candice, Don and, sadly, Little Summer. So attachment has been studied for many years in psychology. It started with really cruel animal experiments. For example, the work of Harry Harlow, which is now considered hideous, back in the 1950s, did an experiment with newborn monkeys. And what Harlow's team did is they took monkeys away from their mothers at birth, and then they wanted to study how these monkeys interacted with dummy mummies, with kind of wire mummy substitutes, which is horrific. These little newborn monkeys were terrified. And they had a choice of two dummy mothers. One was a wire mother, just wire, but she had the food. She had a bottle attached to her. I don't know why I'm gendering a piece of wire, but bear with me. The other mother was the same wire mother, but she was covered in cloth. She was comforting to hold on to. Unless they were very, very hungry, these monkeys clung on to the mother that gave them comfort. They weren't interested in the food mother unless they were hungry. So from that, attachment in animals was considered important, and it's the work of John Bowlby and then later Mary Ainsworth that brought attachment theory into the world of academic psychology. And the work of Mary Ainsworth in the 1970s was interesting, and she did experiments with babies who were around maybe 12 to 18 months old, maybe a little bit older. So they were able to kind of walk and interact with the world, and they were old enough to kind of know the people that were looking after them. And she called this the strange situation. So babies were kind of monitored, were observed with their normal caregiver, usually the mother, and they were watched on how they interact with that caregiver. And then they were watched and observed on their own. So mother leaves and they're on their own. And securely attached infants become upset when the mother leaves because they don't understand. They're in a strange situation. They don't understand whether they're safe or not. And then when they're reunited with the mother, like a minute or two later, they don't leave these babies in this room on their own very long. Then they greet the mother. They greet her. They're pleased that she's back. And then when you introduce a stranger into the room, a strange human into the room, you know, a mother leaves again and then a strange human is introduced, the babies get upset. The babies don't want to interact with the stranger. They perceive danger. And then again, when they're reunited with their mother, they're happy. That's securely attached infants. They show this demonstrative pattern at the age of like 12 to 18 months. However, babies that are insecurely attached, babies that have been neglected or have experienced hardship in their first year of life, not necessarily neglect, it could be another type of hardship, they behave differently than the securely attached infants. Sometimes infants would cling on to a stranger. They'd greet a stranger just like they did their mother. And when their mother re-entered a room after them being left alone, babies did one of two things. They either clung on to her, like clung on to her for dear life, so it was like a really clingy type of behaviour that was beyond being happy that they were reunited but still interested in their environment. Or they avoided her. They avoided her throughout. They were equally nonplussed by being in a room with their mother than they were a stranger. They were like not very discerning. It was like everything, including their mother, was a danger. So this instigated a generation, we're now into, I guess, our second generation of attachment theory studies. So attachment style research was developed. People with different attachment styles were studied in both childhood and adulthood. And also research has gone on to link attachment problems with troubled adult relationships. If you're insecure and you've developed what we could call attachment disorder, you have an extreme example of insecure attachment that is disordered, that is causing you many problems in your life. Without treatment in childhood, without getting you out of that situation and giving you a new situation to learn and grow with treatment, with therapy, with love, with support, with care, that insecure attachment and that attachment disorder is going to follow you throughout your life. And if you think about, the closest and intimate relationships we have in adulthood, it's not with our parents, it's with our intimate partner, our husband, our wife, our girlfriend, our boyfriend. Attachment theory and attachment styles has had much research done on it in relation to relationships. In a recent review of the studies on attachment problems and DV, it's shown that there are links with attachment problems, adults who've got attachment problems, with an increased risk of becoming both a domestic violence victim and a domestic violence perpetrator. But those correlations aren't exact. In some studies, the relationship between attachment problems and DV is really low. In some studies, it's quite high, and there's some reasons for that. It depends on the sample that has been the study of research. It depends on the way that attachment style or attachment disorder is defined, on what type of DV we're talking about, and many other factors as well. So although we can say that attachment disorder or attachment problems is a risk factor for becoming a DV victim or a DV perpetrator, this is not set in stone. Anybody, you could have the most idyllic childhood, and still become a victim of DV. Because DV can happen to anybody. Doesn't matter about your gender, your age, your sexuality, your income level, your educational level, or any other level that we could think of. DV could happen to anybody. And people can get stuck in these really conflicting relationships because they could be securely attached and want to see the best, because there's other factors involved other than attachment. That's why the correlation between attachment disorder and DV in many cases is quite low. But it's still a risk factor, it's still an indication, but there's many other things involved as well. I think what sets aside people with insecure attachments from those with secure attachments is the way that they handle DV. Because I think people with insecure attachments are less able to discern when it's time to leave. They're perhaps more likely to cling on if they've got this really anxious, insecure attachment style. They don't want to be alone. And they very, very quickly get caught in a cycle of violence from their partner. People who are avoidant, so the avoidant attachment style, or that's been called reactive attachment disorder, they're the ones who don't really attach to anybody. They flit from relationship to relationship and they don't really care. They're not really able to have really strong relationship bonds. So they're the ones who might, for example, like cheat multiple times on their partner because they don't care. But these things are not exact, they're just indicators. So I hope I've kind of made that clear. We know that domestic violence is very common. In a study that I was involved in as a researcher a few years ago now, this was just in one city, actually a couple of postal codes in one city in England, we identified 869, I think, violent crimes that had occurred in those postcode areas in a 6-month period. Many of those, I can't remember the exact figures, many of those were repeated victimisations. And almost a quarter of these reports were domestic in nature. And the domestic incidents, the domestic violence, seemed to be ongoing time and time again. You saw the same victim and same offender coming through the system. So it's like really disordered relationships carry on. And psychologists have to ask that question, why? Why don't people just leave? And one of the reasons might be is because they're insecurely attached. But that's just one reason, right? One reason of potentially many. There might be financial reasons, there might be fear for your life, fear for your children's lives. All of those things obviously come into play. We're not just talking about attachment problems here. We're talking about a multitude of problems that come together to create really serious violent situations. That quite frankly, the police have problems. They have problems policing this kind of relationship because victims and perpetrators, even if they're separated, get together time and time again. It's an issue and it's hugely costly to those victims, to their lives, and also to criminal justice, to society in general. So both attachment problems for a variety of mental health reasons and DV for a whole host of reasons have been studied immensely by psychologists because they're so important. Don't know where my dogs have gone. Cassie's here till he's done one. Oh, she came from a different direction. She's done a big round. She's done a big circle. So how does all of this relate to the Wells family? So I've done videos on Don's family essay, Don's family history, and they have a really troubled generational issue there. But so does Candice. So does Candice's family. And I did a video just the other day. And the inspiration for doing this video and the research that I did kind of behind this video was because I just started talking about attachment disorders. I found who Tilly was chasing. Tilly, stay. No, this way. This way. I didn't hear any screaming or barking, so presumably she just did a big round, inspected them and then came back. As I said, Don's family's disordered generation after generation. So is Candice's generation after generation. And again, this is not diagnostic. This is just looking at research and applying it to what we see from the Wells family and what we've heard from others who know the Wells family. So I believe that Don and Candice both have attachment problems. I think Don comes across as self-centered, narcissistic. He doesn't have much empathy for women particularly. But it's Candice that gives me the most concern from an attachment disorder perspective. We heard from a family friend who appeared on Zav Girl a while ago that Candice had a very troubled childhood. Her mother was absent for part of her childhood and she didn't get on with anybody. She didn't have anybody. So her attachments, we don't know what her very, very early life was like, because that's really the most important part. Unlike Summer, who I'm going to come on to in a sec, sadly. We don't know what Candice's very early life was like, but we can assume if she didn't care about anybody, she wasn't attached to anybody in her teenage life, that I think she was displaying signs of reactive attachment disorder. This is just signs that can be gleaned from what people have said about Candice and the way she behaves. Like she runs away from problems. She gets angry very, very quickly. She's mistrustful of everybody. And there's a slew of other things as well that can relate to this. And there's other explanations than attachment disorder. Attachment disorder can link to various other neurodevelopmental disorders like ADHD, autism. Not strongly with autism, interestingly. I think some people with attachment disorder get misdiagnosed with autism when actually they're not autistic. They have an attachment problem. So that's why you can't diagnose somebody online. Right? You can't. You have to do a very detailed clinical assessment over time to get the diagnosis correct, because there's a lot of overlapping in these signs. But to me, you're trapped. There we go. But to me, personally speaking, Candice does show signs of attachment disorder. But that can pass on to the next generation. And a parent who is insecurely attached, not only is there an increased risk of being involved in a conflictual relationship, without treatment, without support, there's also a risk of them becoming really bad parents themselves. Because, look, they've never been set an example. They haven't known what it's like to be parented. It's not their fault. They don't know what it's like to be parented, so they've no example to go from. They've already got their own mental health challenges. They've already got all of the problems that attachment problems can create in an adult. They may have other mental health problems that they've been diagnosed with, that they're dealing with. I believe Candice has a bipolar diagnosis, for example, so if that's true, she's dealing with that. Is she getting treatment for it? Is she on medication for it? Who knows? Is she using addiction as a form of self-medication? Yes, I strongly believe she is. I strongly believe she's very confused, very conflicted. I think part of her wants to be loving, wants to be a good mother, and I think that's why we see sometimes, posts on her Facebook. We see her showing her kids off on TikTok. I think she wants to be a good mother, but she doesn't know how. And she has anger issues. She can't cope with her own life. Team that with a potential bipolar diagnosis that is untreated, perhaps, speculation. Certainly an addiction problem that is untreated. You've got a recipe for disaster. You really have. And Summer displays, to me, an attachment problem. She also displays signs of perhaps like ADHD. She's been, like Dawn has said, that she's hyperactive. She's like all over the place. She's really active. Could be ADHD. It could be just that she's an active kid. But what concerned me was the way that she latches on to lots of people in the church. We saw her cling on to Robin. We saw interviews with Robin. Who Robin was trying to say, she kind of got on our nerves but didn't, and she was just loving on us, and it was difficult to teach when she was like that because she was clinging. And that is a different way that attachment disorders are displayed. So instead of being reactive and avoidant, they go the other way and they cling on to everybody because they want love. They want love. And I think deep down Candice wants love, and she's had a lifetime of disorder, sadly. And sadly, that could have been passed on to Summer. But Summer's displaying this kind of anxious, clingy style, like this disinhibited style of wanting to love on everybody because that's what she needs. I think psychology can give us a lot of answers as to why the Wells and the Bly families are as they are, the problems that they've got. Does it mean that caused Summer's disappearance? No, it doesn't. But it's an indicator of the issues, the many issues that family has. And hopefully, you know, now the boys have been separated, they're getting the therapy that they need so that they don't go on to have the same problems in the future. You know, hopefully there's a plan in place to get Don and Candice treatment. But they have to want it. This is the thing. It's the same with any psychological issue. They have to want it. And if they don't want it, then nobody can help them. Nobody. Not Dr. Phil, nobody. You know, the academic literature is kind of very distant, but then when we relate it to somebody that many of us have fallen in love with, you know, little Summer, it's really hard. It's hard to talk about. So let me know what you think. It's goodbye from me. It's goodbye from Miss Tillington, and it's goodbye from Miss Cassie Springer, who's just disappeared. Bye, guys.